Good evening, folks. Welcome to the 78th session in the Book of Acts. Counting this one, I think we have six more left. At least that's how I have it planned. Whether that works out or not remains to be seen. We're going to start this evening with a reading of Psalm 143, because it ties in a bit with what we're going to be talking about this evening. Psalm 143 reads, Hear my prayer, O Lord. Give ear to my pleas for mercy. In your faithfulness answer me, in your righteousness. Enter not into judgment with your servant, for no one living is righteous before you. For the enemy has pursued my soul, he has crushed my life to the ground, he has made me sit in darkness like those long dead. Therefore my spirit faints within me, my heart within me is appalled. I remember the days of old. I remember on all that you have done. I ponder the work of your hands. I stretch out my hands to you. My soul thirsts for you like a parched land. Answer me quickly, O Lord. My spirit fails. Hide not your face from me, lest I be like those who go down to the pit. Let me hear in the morning of your steadfast love, for in you I trust. Make me know the way I should go, for to you I lift up my soul. Deliver me from my enemies, O Lord. I have fled to you for refuge. Teach me to do your will, for you are my God. Let your good spirit lead me on level ground. For your name's sake, O Lord, preserve my life. In your righteousness, bring my soul out of trouble, and in your steadfast love, you will cut off my enemies, and you will destroy all the adversaries of my soul, for I am your servant. A good uh, summation of who Paul was, God's servant for the gospel. We are going to be in Acts chapter 24 this evening. Paul giving his defense before Felix in Caesarea. We talked last week about what we read last week wasn't really about Paul. It was more about the Roman commander spiriting Paul out of the plot that the Jews had hatched against Paul to ambush him on the way down to the Sanhedrin Council for closer questioning. And they were going to ambush Paul with 40 men who had taken a vow not to eat or drink until they had succeeded in so doing, which they didn't do. So Lysias hears of the plot through Paul's nephew and takes a large force, armed soldiers, and they make an escape at night and bring Paul to Caesarea, where the governor of Judea, Felix, um, Antonius Felix, is currently residing. We've talked a bit in the past about Felix, that he was a former slave. He'd been freed and he rose in power. He was appointed as the governor over Judea. He was not nobly born, as they would put it. He did not come from the ruling class, but he married three times, and each of his wives was a princess. So there's some ties. There are some ties there. His first wife, and we know this from the writings of Josephus and Tertullian, not Tertullian, Tacitus, sorry, Tacitus, who was a Roman historian and wrote prolifically about the Roman emperors and various ruling individuals. His first wife was the granddaughter of Mark Antony and Cleopatra. So a fairly well-known couple from Roman history. His second wife is unnamed, and there's a little bit of confusion if she was a second wife or his third wife. But his third wife is Drusilla of Judea, who was the daughter of Herod Agrippa I and his wife Cypros. She had previously been married to Gaius Julius Caesar, who is the king of Emesa. She was very young, probably 18 or 19 when these events are taking place. She was attracted to Felix because of Felix's ambition and his ruthlessness to achieve his end goals, according to those who write the histories. So she divorced her husband to marry Felix, who invited her to be his wife because she was beautiful. He was attracted to her physically. She's attracted to him because he's a man of power and make can make her rise in the social ranks, which would be important to a young princess who is the daughter of a Jewish mother. I'm going to read for you Acts chapter 24, and then we're going to make a few comments about it. Um, it's an interesting chapter. Think of the trial of Jesus as I'm reading this, and the Jews are making their argument, and there's Gail with her camera on. It's nice to see you. Um, think of Jesus standing trial before the high priest and the Sanhedrin and the false witnesses who are giving testimony against him, and compare that with what's going on here as the Jewish lawyer Tertullus is presenting their case before Felix in the governor's place of trial here in Caesarea. Acts chapter 24. And after 5 days, the high priest Ananias came down with some elders and a spokesman, one Tertullus. They laid before the governor their case against Paul. And when he had been summoned, Tertullus began to accuse him, saying, since through you we enjoy much peace, and since by your foresight, most excellent Felix, reforms are being made for this nation in every way and everywhere, we accept this with all gratitude. But to detain you no further, I beg your kindness to hear us briefly, for we have found this man a plague, one who stirs up riots among all the Jews throughout the world and is a ringleader of the sect of the Nazarenes. He even tried to profane the temple, but we seized him. Examining him yourself, you will be able to find out from him about everything of which we accuse him. The Jews also joined in the charge, affirming that all these things were so. And when the governor had nodded to him to speak, Paul replied, knowing that for many years you have been a judge over this nation, I cheerfully make my defense. You can verify that it is not more than 12 days since I went up to worship in Jerusalem, and they did not find me disputing with anyone or stirring up a crowd, either in the temple or in the synagogues or in the city. Neither can they prove to you what they now bring up against me. But this I confess to you, that according to the way which they call a sect, I worship the God of our fathers, believing everything laid down by the law and written in the prophets, having a hope in God, which these men themselves accept, that there will be a resurrection both of the just and the unjust. So I always take pains to have a clear conscience toward both God and man. Now after several years I came to bring alms to my nation and to present offerings. While I was doing this, they found me purified in the temple without any crowd or tumult. But some Jews from Asia, they ought to be here before you and make an accusation should they have anything against me, or else let these men themselves say what wrongdoing they found when I stood before the council, other than this one thing that I cried out while standing among them. It is with respect to the resurrection of the dead that I am on trial before you this day. But Felix, having a rather accurate knowledge of the way, put them off, saying, when Lysias the tribune comes down, I will decide your case. Then he gave orders to the centurion that he should be kept in custody, but have some liberty, and that none of his friends should be prevented from attending his needs. After some days, Felix came with his wife Drusilla, who was Jewish, and he sent for Paul and heard him speak about faith in Christ Jesus. And as he reasoned about righteousness and self-control and the coming judgment, Felix was alarmed and said, go away for the present. When I get an opportunity, I will summon you. At the same time, he hoped that money would be given him by Paul, so he sent for him often and conversed with him. When 2 years had elapsed, Felix was succeeded by Porcius Festus, and desiring to do the Jews a favor, Felix left Paul in prison. And the reason I asked you to pay attention to the evidence that's being presented against Paul is that you notice these Jews don't bring any false witnesses. They don't bring anyone who can back up their claim saying, we saw Paul doing such and so. The man that the Jews bring, and they bring their best. Okay. 5 days have elapsed since Paul was spirited out of Jerusalem. Paul, in his testimony to Felix, says it's been 12 days since I came to Jerusalem. He spent 7 days in Jerusalem going through the rite of purification that James had suggested to him. The Jews arrested him, and that very night, Paul was spirited away to Caesarea. 5 days later, here come Ananias, some of the elders, and they bring an orator. They bring a rhetorician, the Greek word rhetor. They come they come heavily armed with a lot of words and very little evidence. None at all, really. Luke uses this term, I think, calling, I think the NIV says that Tertullus, that he was a lawyer. It's either the NIV or the NAS that says that. The man is very skilled in legal proceedings and is very eloquently spoken. He knows how to use words very subtly. The defense that, or the rather, the accusation that he's going to lay before Felix is entirely political in nature. He's trying to paint Paul as uh, the leader of a rebellion. Paul, in making his defense to Felix, is going to push that aside and say, no, here's the real reason I'm here. We're having a theological debate. I say one thing, they say another thing. Felix is no dummy. He rose to the station that he is currently at, yes, through cunning and through ruthless means, but he has been playing the game of Roman politics for a long time. And so he's clever, and he can smell out a lie. In fact, Tertullus is kind of uh, intimates that in his argument. You, Felix, you're a wise enough man. You're able to see the truth of what we're saying. Yes, Felix was a clever man, and he could see through the argument that the Jews were making. But we need to back up and make a couple of uh, comments here. Here comes Ananias, the high priest, who is a Sadducee, one of the party of the Sadducees. He does not believe in the resurrection, and so he is going to take issue with what Paul has to say here, in that all of these men agree that there is a hope of the resurrection, and he hints at Daniel chapter 12, verse 2 in his defense, but we'll get there in just a moment. But the question I have is, where are Paul's defenders? The Jews come with superiority in numbers. We're going to bring lots of guys. We're going to overwhelm Felix with our eloquence and with our words and with our numbers, and he's going to see how many of us there are, all nodding our heads vigorously and agreeing with what you have to say, and he'll know that we're right. And there's Paul. He doesn't have anybody to bear witness to him. Where are James and the apostles, or the Jerusalem elders? Why didn't they come? Um, what about Philip? Philip, the evangelist, he lives in Caesarea. He's got daughters who are prophetesses. We read about them earlier when Paul was on his way to Jerusalem. Luke is silent about this. There may have been others in attendance, but probably not. Paul has the Holy Spirit on his side, and he needs nobody else to plead his case and testify on his behalf. The elders from Jerusalem, or the elders of the church in Caesarea, the believers, would have no influence either with the Jews or with Felix. So they wouldn't lend any credence to the things that Paul has to say. But it seems like the Jews expected Paul to have a crowd, which I think is part of the reason they leave behind false witnesses. Um, False witnesses add to the shouting match. And sometimes in a trial, he who shouts the loudest is the one who wins the trial. Because if one party is out shouting the other party, uh, they sound righter or more correct, um, because they have more voices speaking for them. It's what they did in Acts chapter 6, verse 13 against Stephen. They brought false witnesses against Stephen, saying that he has spoken against the temple, he's spoken against the law of Moses, he's speaking against the ways of the Jews, saying that Jesus is the Messiah, which is true. He's preaching Jesus, but he is not denigrating Judaism at all in so doing. He's not desecrating the temple. He's not speaking against the law. But they bring false witnesses against him, and the Sanhedrin gets stirred up by the false witnesses to the point that they stone him to death. So the Jews come with their armed with their fancy uh, flowery speaker, who says in verse 2, and he starts, there's four parts to this speech. Verses 2 and 3, we have flattery. He's going to flatter Felix. Verse 4, he makes a plea for brevity. Hear us briefly. We don't want to waste your time, so we're going to keep it short. Then verses 5 through verse 6a, he lays out the charges. Verse 6b through verse 8, he speaks about Lysias's interference, and we'll get to that because if you were following along with me in a New American Standard Version, I skipped a couple of verses, or what amounts to two verses that are in a footnote in the English Standard Version and a footnote in the NIV. And we'll talk about why that is. But Tertullus begins with flattery. He, I think, is seeking to make Felix favorable to their cause through very insincere flattery. He starts with the words, "We enjoy much peace." Felix was one of the bloodiest Judean governors, suppressing the Jews left and right and executing many people. He was not a man of peace. Now, the peace of Rome, the Pax Romana that you've probably heard about, was the peace that was kept by the Roman military in the provinces that they controlled. And if you lived a peaceable life and you went along with what the Romans said you had to do, you lived a very peaceful life. They did not bother you, you didn't bother them. You start rabble rousing, though. You start whispering among your neighbors, we really ought to throw off these Roman overlords. Now you're violating the peace of Rome. Rome had one answer for violating the peace of Rome. They came and made you very peaceful. So peaceful that you just stopped breathing and everything was very calm as you lay there in your tomb, resting peacefully. They enforced the peace forcibly. You were going to be peaceful or else. And it's interesting that Tertullus is going to accuse Paul of being a rabble rouser and disturbing the Roman peace, but he says, we enjoy so much peace because of your governorship. When Felix is routinely suppressing Jewish practices, he says, secondly, that reforms are being made all over our nation. Yes, Felix was making reforms that controlled the practice of Jewish religion. Do you think the Jews like having their religion meddled with? No. The Jews are very strict about the form and practice of their religion, and so they routinely pushed back against the reforms and the the presence of the Romans, period, in Jerusalem. stirred them up. The presence of the Romans at the temple in Jerusalem just outraged them. But they were there because of Felix. And he says, we accept this with gratitude everywhere, all the time, in every way. Felix knows this is false because the harder he suppressed the people, the more they pushed back and rebelled, to the point that Nero finally had to remove him from the governorship of Judea because it was becoming so, um, it was a pressure cooker and it was ready to blow. And it did shortly after Felix is removed and the Jewish war breaks out after he is taken out. Tertullus is going to accuse Paul of being a threat to Roman peace. And when he makes the accusation of Paul defiling the temple, that is an accusation that Paul is going against the reforms that Felix is putting in place. And so he he's flattered him, he's buttered him up, getting him ready to listen. And he says in verse 4, but I don't want to waste your time. Your time is valuable. You're an important man. I'm just going to simply state the case, and you're a wise enough individual to see the truth of it. Again, an attempt to get Felix on his side. You're too important. This matter can be easily cleared up. Just hear what we have to say and then act like you've acted against people who are guilty of sedition in the past. The Jews have very carefully crafted the charges that Tertullus is going to present. It's like when the Pharisees come to Jesus with a question to trap him. They don't just come up with these things out of the blue. They formulate these things and they look at them from every different angle, and then they set up this scenario so that Jesus has no possible way to escape. Look at John 8, the woman taken in adultery. We caught this woman, Rabbi, in the very act of adultery. The law of Moses says, stone such a one. What do you say? It's illegal for the Jews to stone the woman by Roman law. So if he says stone her, they can haul him off to the Romans and say, this man is practicing, is teaching us to do things that are illegal against Roman law. If Jesus says, don't stone her, well, now he's defying the law of Moses, and they've got him there. And since those are the only two answers he can possibly give, stone her, don't stone her, Jesus comes up with a third answer. Let he who is without sin cast the first stone at her. And they leave. But they had put that scenario together with a lot of care in order to trap Jesus. And they've put this scenario together with a lot of care in order to trap Paul. He says in verse 5, we found this man a plague. The NAS says he's a pest. I really like that. He's a real pest. We found this man, one who stirs up riots among all the Jews throughout the world. In other words, everywhere he goes, he's stirring up rebellion. He is stirring up sedition. Felix had repeatedly crucified the leaders of various uprisings and killed a lot of their followers who had disturbed the peace of Rome. Josephus writes about this in Jewish Wars, Book 2. And so Tertullus's aim here, with the support of his fellows, is to put Paul on the same level and cast him in the same light as these insurrectionists, so that when he's done with his argument, he hopes that Felix will deal with Paul just as he has dealt with the other insurrectionists who have been brought before him, the ones he had put to death. So the Romans kill Paul. Problem solved. If he releases Paul to us and says, you guys take care of it, problem solved. We kill him on the way back home. Either way, Paul's dead. So an airtight no way out of this trap, except that Paul has the Spirit on his side, and they don't really take that into account. This man is a plague. They're implying that Paul is like a disease that can spread if he's not stopped. If you leave him be, he's just going to stir up rebellion, and you'll see, you'll be at fault, Felix. It'll be on your head that he disturbed the peace of Rome here in the province over which you are governor. And you know how Nero will handle that. You know how the Roman emperor is going to feel about that, because your head will roll along with everybody else's. He stirs up riots. This is a charge of sedition. This is the most serious charge that he's laying before Felix. Um, it's like the charge that was put before Pilate about Jesus in Luke chapter 23, verse 2. It's one of the most serious charges that can be uh, one can be brought up on in a Roman court, because the Romans took sedition very seriously. They did not like rebellion. Again, peace of Rome. You're going to be a peaceful person. You're going to be a peaceful citizen. You're going to enjoy the blessings of the Roman Empire and live peaceably. You live peaceably, we'll deal with you peaceably. You pay your taxes and you can live like you want to live. And for the most part, that was true. He's a ringleader of the Nazarenes. He's spinning Christianity as a political sect and Paul as a quasi-military leader of that sect. There were a lot of sects within Judaism. The Sadducees are a sect. The Pharisees are a sect. The Essenes were a sect. Um, and he's calling the Nazarenes, they're also a sect, but he's saying this group is dangerous. This group is a group you need to watch. This is a group of people, they're dangerously different. He might have gone on to say that they teach that there's another king, not Caesar. There's another king named Jesus, which could be a charge of treason to lay at the feet of Paul. In fact, Paul tried to profane the temple, which explains the violent reaction of the Jews. Uh, the violent response from the Jews. A Jewish riot has serious implications, and Felix knows from Lysias's letter that there had been a riot taking place, that the Jews were intent on killing Paul. And here they're explaining why. We reacted so violently because this man was defiling the temple. And you know how sacred the temple is to Jewish religion, and they were granted some lenience toward enforcing the law as it pertained to the temple. And so they he asserts here that they seized Paul because of the alleged temple defilement. Um, he sort of omits the fact that they were rioting at the time when Lysias came and took Paul out of his hands, out of their hands, rather. In fact, and this is part of the verses that are missing from this account, the implication is going to be that uh, Lysias, the the proconsul, not proconsul, the tribune in Jerusalem, the guy who's commander over the 1,000 troops, that he was the one who started the violence. He was the one who acted violently. If you have a Bible that has a footnote or you have a New American Standard, you'll see that uh, at the end of verse 6, you should have a footnote that says, some manuscripts add, and we would have judged him according to our law. But the chief captain Lysias came and with great violence took him out of our hands, commanding his accusers to come before you. The New American Standard sets it right in the text, set off with brackets. Um, Words it just a little bit differently. We wanted to judge him according to our own law, but Lysias, the commander, came along and with much violence took him out of our hands, ordering his accusers to come before you. Whether or not this is part of the original text. It's not present in the oldest manuscripts, but it does do an awful lot to explain the how they got there, and it adds a further spin that the Jews are putting on this event, um, showing that we weren't the violent ones. It was the Roman guy. It was your soldier fella who came, and he used too much violence. He with great violence, he beat us up, and he took our prisoner away from us. We want him back. Um, he denied us our lawful right to execute the apostate because he defiled the temple. And whether this is just a Reader's Digest condensed version of the accusation that Tertullus puts before Felix, or it really was this brief, is unknown. The way he ends it after the Jews also joined in the charge, affirming that all these things were so. He says in verse 8, by examining him yourself, you will be able to find out from him about everything of which we accuse him. There's two implications there. Number one is you're smart enough, Felix, to hear the truth behind our words. And also, if you rule against us, Felix, that means you're an idiot because it's so plainly obvious and true that anybody with a grain of intelligence could tell this. This is sort of dangerous ground. But he's a speech maker. If you have heard someone who is a professional speaker, who is very eloquent and can move a crowd and can, control the emotions and the tempo and the temperature of the crowd and can stir them up at the right time and calm them down at the right time, then stir them back up. Tertullus is doing this very same thing. He's using his words smoothly to influence Felix because his speech lacks one thing: evidence. He has no evidence of the claims that he is making. And so when Felix nods to Paul to make his defense, um, Paul is going to address each of the charges in turn and end with pointing out, if they had anything against me, you'd think the accusers would actually be here in front of you to state their case, which they're not. It's the Sanhedrin was not present when Paul was arrested. That was in the middle of a riot. They weren't even there. And so Paul addresses the charges and begins his speech in verse 10, knowing that for many years you have been a judge over this nation, I cheerfully make my defense. What he's hinting at there is you've been here long enough that you know the Jews. You know Ananias and the type of man he is. You've dealt with them long enough that uh, you're wise to their ploys. I think a lot of that is in the subtext unspoken by Paul here. He doesn't resort to flattery. He simply says, I'm glad to make my defense in front of you because you've been here a long time and you know the Jews and you know them well. And so he addresses the charges, each in turn, by saying, you can verify in verse 11, it's not more than 12 days since I went up to worship in Jerusalem. I have never tried to start a political uprising. He's been in Herod's fortress here for 5 days. I imagine that stirring up a crowd into fomenting a rebellion probably takes more than 7 days, even if you're a gifted speaker. I don't know how quickly these things start, but I think that's the implication that what Paul is implying is, I haven't been here long enough to stir up riots. Um, You can verify it's not more than 12 days since I went up to worship in Jerusalem. I came here to worship, not to foment rebellion. They did not find me disputing with anyone or stirring up a crowd in the temple, in the synagogues, or in the city. No place. No place can they say or give witnesses who will say that Paul was stirring up crowds. Not in the temple, nowhere in the city, not in the synagogues, that he was there for worship. He was there to purify himself. And he's going to say a little bit later on here, I came bringing alms to my nation. I came to bring relief to those who have been hit by the famine that Jerusalem had been going through. In fact, uh, because they didn't find him disputing uh, or stirring up a crowd or in a temple, he was alone when they arrested him. Do you remember that? Paul had gone up to the temple as the days for the purification were drawing to an end. He went to the temple. He was by himself. There weren't other people with him. No crowd, no followers. This ringleader of being a Nazarene. Where are my followers? Why aren't they here? Why wouldn't they be railing or protesting outside, saying, "Let Paul go, set Paul free"? He answers the charge of them being a ringleader. If he was a ringleader, he would have followers around them. The Jews can't cite any following that Paul has, and in fact, they can't prove to you what they now bring up against me. This, I think, applies to the defilement of the temple. Um, they can't prove this. In fact, in verse 14, and this is what I confess to you. This is the real reason. Here's the reason why Ananias and these guys are here. It's not because of political sedition. Rather, according to the way which they call a sect, and this is the term that's used of the church throughout the book of Acts, chapter 9, verse 2, chapter 16, verse 17, chapter 18, verses 25 and 26, and other verses in Acts refers to the church as the way, because Jesus said in John 14, I am the way, the truth, and the life. And so that label stuck for a time with the church. I confess that I follow the according to the way, which they call a sect. I worship the God of our fathers, believing everything laid down in the law and written in the prophets, having a hope in God. And here's the reason he's on trial. I have a hope in God for the resurrection. And he says, these guys here, these men here themselves accept, which means there must have been some Pharisees and the elders that came before Felix, because Paul would have known the Pharisees would agree with that statement. Not Felix, Ananias wouldn't agree with it, but the uh, the Pharisees would have. Daniel chapter 12 and verse 2 is the verse that he's alluding to, this resurrection of the just and the unjust. Uh, Daniel 12, verse 2, and many of those who sleep in the dust of the earth shall awake, some to everlasting life, and some to shame and everlasting contempt, a resurrection of the just and the unjust. My conscience is clear. He goes on to say, I take pains to have a clear conscience toward God because judgment's coming. I want to be right with God and I want to be right with men. And so I take pains to have the clear conscience before these people. And then he goes on to explain why he's in Jerusalem at all. I was bringing alms to my nation. After several years, I came back to present alms. And while I was doing this, they found me purified in the temple without any crowd. That was by myself, without any tumult. They found me. Yeah, I was there. purifying myself, not defiling the temple, but being purified. No crowd with me, no tumult with me. And the Jews from Asia saw me there. And I love verse 19. They ought to be here before you to make an accusation should they have anything against me. As a Roman citizen, you have the right to face your accusers. His accusers aren't there. We have the Sanhedrin, and Paul sort of disarms them, saying, let these men who I stood before tell you what I did wrong. The only thing I did was make this statement. It is with respect to the resurrection of the dead that I am on trial before you this day. And that's when they erupted into a tumult and broke down into a disagreement. These are the only things. My accusers about the from the temple, they're not here. And these men here, let them present evidence of my wrongdoing. I made one statement. And if you go back to chapter, let's see, 22, after Paul, the servant of the high priest, strikes Paul, and Paul speaks out against him, and then he apologizes in verse 5. He makes that one statement, brothers, I am a Pharisee, a son of Pharisees. This is chapter 23, verse 6. It is with respect to the hope of the resurrection of the dead that I am on trial. That's the one statement he makes. And kaboom, it's like dropping a bomb in the midst of the crowd, and they all get up in arms in front of him. And so Paul presents the facts to Felix. And like I said, Felix is a clever individual. I think he can see through the tissue paper that the Jews are holding up, painting Paul as a radical, as an insurrectionist. But at the same time, um, he knows he can't send Paul back with them. But at the same time, as a favor to the Jews, he's going to hold on to Paul and not release him. He's protecting him from the Jews, and he's also going to sort of take him out of circulation there. But verse 22 is interesting, where it says that Felix, having a rather accurate knowledge of the way, meaning that Felix was acquainted with the church. He was acquainted with the gospel. He knew about the teachings. How? Luke doesn't tell us. It may be that he has heard, because there is a church presence there in Caesarea. Philip the evangelist was known for preaching. He may have heard Philip preach. He may have Christians among his advisors. It's not an unthinkable thing. He would have Jewish advisors who would help him in dealing with the Jewish nation, people who could uh, educate him about their customs. Someone has obviously educated him about the church. And so he knows about this sect of the Nazarenes that the the Jewish lawyer is trying to disparage. And he puts them off and says, when Lysias the tribune comes down, I will decide your case. This effectively disarms the Jews because Lysias sent Felix a letter. Felix has no need to call him down to present any evidence. Now, if the Jews want to go back and plead with Lysias, the tribune, to come to Caesarea and take their side in matters, they're free to do so, but they don't have a real leg to stand on with him. They've rioted twice in his presence when he has had to forcibly rescue Paul from their hands. So he's not favorably disposed toward the Jews. So he really pulls the teeth of the Jews. They can't do anything. They don't have any way of appealing this decision because there's no authority higher than uh, Felix unless they go to Rome and complain to the emperor, and they're not going to do that. Surely, their their anger at Paul is not that great. So he acts from some knowledge. He knew from Lysias's letter the facts that his subordinate had told him. He knows about the sect of the Nazarenes, or he knows about the way, and he also knows the Jews. Remember what Paul said, you've been governor over the Jews for a long time now. He knows the Jews. He knows Ananias. Ananias was high priest appointed by Rome anyway, not a legitimate high priest, but the one that the Romans had put in place. And Ananias was noted for being a political individual himself, um, and pandering to the Romans, seeking their favor, but also a man of cruel ambitions uh, himself in the way that he ruled over the Sanhedrin. So he knows enough here to see through this argument against Paul. So he gives orders in verse 23 that Paul should be kept in custody. This is a protective custody, but have some liberty. He's more or less under house arrest, but he has freedom to receive visitors, maybe to teach those who come. Who knows? He has some freedom there, and he's going to be staying there, languishing there for 2 years. And it's interesting that in verse 24 that Felix came with his wife Drusilla to Paul to hear him speak about faith in Jesus Christ. He's interested. He wants to hear what Paul has to say until Paul starts speaking out about righteousness and self-control and the coming judgment. And the Greek uses a fairly strong word where it says Felix was alarmed. Felix was frightened by what Paul had to say. And so he sends Paul away and says, that's enough for now. That's enough for now. I don't want to listen to you anymore. Because Paul's preaching is probably hitting too close to home for Felix. The gospel is an uncomfortable message because it makes no bones about us being sinners. It very pointedly tells us that we have sinned, that we've fallen short of the glory of God, that we cannot save ourselves from this sin, and that there is a judgment coming against sin. And so Paul is probably preaching that message strongly, and it alarms Felix. We don't hear any more about his wife. This is the only verse where she is mentioned here. He says, "Go away for present. When I get an opportunity, when the time is right, I'll summon you again." And he does so. In verse 26, at the same time, he hoped that money would be given to him by Paul, so he sent for him often and conversed with him. He's hoping Paul will bribe him to be set free. Here's some money. You look the other way, and we'll be on our merry way. Felix is a greedy man. Paul probably preached a message against avarice and greed, which disturbed Felix. And he didn't want to hear that. And yet at the same time, he's not willing to give up that practice. And we're told in verse 27, when 2 years had elapsed, Felix was succeeded by Porcius Festus in desiring to do the Jews a favor, that is, the Jews back in Jerusalem. Felix left Paul in prison. He's going to leave Paul behind for a successor to deal with. And next week we'll look in chapter 25 as Paul speaks before Festus, and then along come Agrippa and Bernice to also hear what Paul has to say in chapters 25 and 26. But next week we're going to be looking at we'll look at the first 22 verses of chapter 25 just Paul's dealings, specifically with Festus before Agrippa comes, because there's some interesting stuff to bring out of that. So I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording just a little bit early this evening.